this evening, whom it is my pleasure to introduce. Dr. Tola Dabiri, newly minted PhD, and as a fellow scholar in the trenches of PhD life, I know what that means. I know what that takes. So we extend our hearty congratulations to newly minted Dr. Tola Dabiri, PhD. Tola Dabiri has a PhD from Leeds Beckett University, and her research area is orality and the intangible cultural heritage of carnival and masquerade. And Tola has a special interest in and affection for Grenada. I fully understand that. In addition to her doctoral thesis, Decoding 21st Century Carnival, Tola has published papers in the Caribbean Quarterly and the International Journal of Caribbean Arts. In her professional life, Tola has over 20 years experience in working in the cultural sector in the UK and has developed and managed a number of successful projects, including the digital project Carnival in a Box, carnivalinabox.co.uk in 2020, fundraising for Archives for the National Archives, and the UKCCA's HLF-funded Carnival Archive project, www.carnivalarchives.org.uk. In her earlier career, Tola worked at the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council and the library services across London. Tola is a consultant in the cultural sector, specializing in project management, equality and inclusion, and fundraising. In addition, Tola is the director of two nonprofit organizations, Museum X and Brick by Brick Communities. To deliver the virtual annual Commemorative Emancipation Public Lecture 2020, titled Orality and the Traditional Mass of Grenada, the exploration of traditional mass as a source of historical information about the retention of African intangible cultural heritage, it is my pleasure to welcome with us this evening, Dr. Tola Dabiri.
Thank you so very much, Tesfa. And thank you to everyone else who's looking forward to this lecture. I really hope that I don't disappoint, but I really enjoy talking about mass and masquerade, so I hope that you'll enjoy this lecture with me as well. I have a presentation which I will share with you, but as you can see, we still have speaker view, so you can still see me. So let me, okay. So first of all, I'd like to say the beautiful introductory music was sung by the big drum singers, Patricia Johnson, and Maria Hill, and it's recorded by me on Caracou in 2018. So my many thanks to the University of the West Indies Open Campus Grenada and the Institute for People's Enlightenment for this enormous honour to deliver this lecture to commemorate Emancipation Day. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of the people who helped me to conduct my field research when I visited Grenada. So I'll just quickly mention a few people. The Verkor Players of St Mark's, Andy Purser, the captain of the Hermitage Shortney Players, Glenn Forsyth of St David's Jab Jab Players and Pierre Monton. I still can't pronounce that properly, excuse me, Glenn. Livingston Nelson of the Tivoli Drummers, Banger, the Shakespeare Mass Player from Montreal on Caracou, Patricia Johnson and Maria Hill, who I've mentioned, who are big drum players on Caracou, Yami, the Wild Indian Mass Player at Coles Gap, St David's, David Thomas of the Grenadian Folk Dance School, Clemencia Alexander from Caracou Museum, the Grenadian Cultural Foundation, Dr. Beverly Steele, Dr. Nicole Philip Dowles, and so many more of you that I don't have time to name here. And I would also like to thank Amber and Pansy Cross for their unrepayable hospitality when I stayed with them. I'm going to be talking to you about the traditional mass of Grenada, African cultural retention and orality. Emancipation from enslavement, we know, was not the end of the struggle for peoples of African descent. It was followed by the fight for the end of colonialism, and our struggle continues under different banners. Currently, these banners are the Black Lives Matter movement, decolonization, and restitution. But whatever the banner and the demands are always the same: peace, equality, and justice. We have been told repeatedly that Africans in the Caribbean, America, and South America were deculturalized during enslavement. That's to say that their descendants' culture is borrowed and creolized from historic interaction with the European plantocracy and indentured servants. We have been told that as Africans, we have no written historical records and can produce little archaeological evidence, and therefore no pre-colonial history of any worth existed in Africa before the arrival of the Europeans. I profoundly disagree with these ideas, and I challenge them in my research. And I have turned to Grenada and Carriacou with its deep and vibrant roots in intangible cultural heritage and large population of West African descent to help me with this task. What we have seen is that where the historical records do not fit with the Eurocentric narrative, this evidence has been ignored. For example, the magnificent stone buildings of the palaces of Great Zimbabwe, the centre of a powerful and international trading empire in South Africa, has been falsely recognised as the lost city of Atlantis. The largest earthworks ever constructed in the world, the city of Benin, was obliterated from historical memory, along with its physical presence, after the punitive expedition in 1897. And I am equally amused and outraged by the CBS 60 Minutes documentary broadcast in 2019, which muses how angels built the magnificent churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, because it could not possibly have been the achievement of Africans 800 years ago. It is important to acknowledge and remember these incredible achievements of African history to avoid the trap that was set for us 500 years ago, the trap that says that there is no value and therefore no distinction between peoples and African cultures peoples in Africa and their culture. For me, it's not enough to say African or even West African. And therefore, in my research, I have explored where in Africa or where in West Africa these cultural expressions come from and tried to identify potential roots of Grenadian cultural heritage in African practices. I do not say this to be diverse. In fact, I believe that there's greater knowledge that greater knowledge is a unifying thing that tightens the bonds between Caribbean and African people by celebrating a shared past whilst acknowledging the divergences which have taken place as our shared beginnings in Africa have taken us on different paths in the diaspora. My lecture is about how traditional maths can challenge the theory that enslaved Africans became deculturalized. That is to say, that it's believed that all the enslaved Africans lost their language, religion, and cultural identity during the trauma of the Middle Passage, enslavement, and displacement in the plantation system. However, in my research, I look at how traditional maths acts as a repository of history and culture, and is a place of retention of African heritage, which has been continued to be passed on with the descendants of enslaved Africans for generations. A close examination of traditional maths allows the identification of living links between peoples of African descent, and therefore it can play its part in repairing these disrupted histories. I am not alone in looking at African retention in Caribbean culture. Other scholars, such as Zobar Marshall's examination of the Anansi stories, Hollis Liverpool's work about Carnival in Trinidad, Ashinoki's work about Carriacou, and your own Lorna McDaniel's work on Big Drum have also looked at this topic. My work is about the traditional maths of Grenada and Carriacou, and I will be exploring this in this lecture. Although I want this lecture to be as accessible as possible, I'm aware that I've been steeped in academia for some time now, and so before I go any further, I'd like to explain some of the terms I'll be using. And so, when I say orality, I mean it's the act of using, sharing, and preserving knowledge using speech alone. Deculturalization, as I alluded to just earlier, is the theory that Africans and the diaspora have lost their African cultural identity, and this occurred during enslavement. Decolonization is a movement to rid colonial narratives from all aspects of the lives of people of African descent. And mass is the shortened form of masquerade for those of you who have not fallen under its spell. Now, as a British Nigerian, I cannot tell you in Grenada about your traditional mass and heritage. During my research, I've been lucky enough to be the recipient of your generous support and the free sharing of your knowledge with me, both when I visited Grenada and since from the members of the Institute of People's Enlightenment and members of the Grenadian diaspora in the UK. I am very grateful that today I have the opportunity to tell you how I've used this knowledge in my research, why Grenada and Carriacou have been my focus, and why I believe that mass and traditional mass are important. But to explain this, first of all, I need to tell you about my journey into and around Carnival and Masquerade. My work in Carnival began at the UK Centre for Carnival Arts in Luton in 2011, when I was appointed the project manager of the Carnival Archive project. Our task was to develop a digital archive about Carnival in the east of England, and I had a wonderful team. I had become interested in oral cultures as an undergraduate many years before, and I had studied orality in the Roma people of southern England. This interest was rekindled when I began to meet and talk with Caribbean carnivalists when I was working on the archive project. To my amazement, I could see a functioning oral culture in the Caribbean carnivalists I met. And as this was an archive project, I asked them about carnival heritage. Some of the responses I received talked about how carnival was the result of enslaved Africans imitating their masters. Now, at this time, I knew very little about carnival, masquerade, or Caribbean history, but I knew that this was not true, and I was compelled to begin my journey to find out more. I began to explore and then challenge the ideas that continue to remain prominent in the discourse around the transportation, enslavement, and colonization of Africans in the Caribbean. Those of deculturalization and the complete creolization of African culture. These narratives have played into discussions about carnival and masquerade. In academic research, carnival is often only described as a Lenten Christian festival of excess and transgression and rule breaking, which in the Caribbean is described as the Bacchanal. Central to this, I believe, is the almost universal application of Bakhtin's theory of carnival and the carnivalesque, which describes carnival in these terms, without including the intangible cultural heritage of ancestor worship, tradition, and ritual, all of which are essential elements of Caribbean carnival and masquerade. To use Bakhtin's theories alone does not allow for a complete exploration of the very things that are intangible cultural heritage, nor the information stored within carnival and mass. At the beginning of my research, I began to tentatively examine and compare mass costumes design and making in the UK with examples in the Caribbean and West Africa. I looked at the wearing of body harnesses and backpacks in the Dogon people of Mali and how backpacks can be seen widely in Caribbean carnival costumes, particularly in pretty mass. I looked at the Ageris, Yoruba stilt walkers in Nigeria and the tradition of Mokos and of Moko Jombis in many places across the Caribbean, their place in ancestor worship and the heartbreaking stories of how they walked across the sea to offer protection to the Africans taken into enslavement. Early in my PhD research, I visited many carnivals in the UK to look for traditional mass. And it was at Juvet at Notting Hill Carnival in 2016 that I saw my first Jab Jab players in London, accompanied by tin, iron and pan as they paraded up and down Ladbroke Grove, a glorious place to be. But how had the Jab Jab got to London? From this early research and my interest in history and archives, I began to look at traditional mass itself, not just the annual occurrence of the carnival performance, but traditional mass itself as a repository of information about intangible cultural heritage, and which, using orality, have preserved and transmitted the African culture brought during enslavement. This culture has been retained in the Caribbean and beyond. I concluded that this stored information in the intangible cultural heritage of mass and its link to African cultural heritage could be used to challenge the idea of the complete deculturalization of the African during enslavement. This, combined with my interest in orality, was the starting point of the work which has brought me here to my examination of retained intangible cultural heritage in mass in Grenada. The lack of written records is used to undermine any change in the discourse around African and diasporic African history. In academic examinations, the reliance on texts and the fact that most contemporary accounts were written by European and Western commentators and not Africans has meant that this very version of history has prevailed, that of the European and Western cultures. However, I argue that orality, the preservation and transmission of knowledge using speech, can and has accurately preserved the history and culture of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, and that this has been passed down through the generations. In his influential work on orality, the late Walter Ong describes how oral cultures use memory, apprentice-style learning, and proverbs to preserve and transmit the knowledge of their culture. When we look at the behaviour within traditional masquerading groups, it is clear to see, as I saw in Luton, that this oral culture continues to exist. But although Ong writes about societies moving from orality to literacy, I believe that orality and literacy coexist in a state that I describe as a fluid orality. In this fluid orality, people move between oral and literate states depending on the situation and the environment. So orality in the mass camp, band meeting and panyard, literacy at work and in school. Even though orality continues to be mistrusted as an historical source, in my experience, it is a valid place for starting further research. Globally and historically, orality has been used most widely Globally and historically, orality has been used most widely to record history. Orality is the key to unlocking our pre-colonial past and decolonizing our future. Orality has allowed the diasporic Grenadian communities in Canada, the US, and the UK to take their intangible cultural heritage and masquerade with them as they have migrated around the world. And so we see Jab Jab from St David's, Vercors from St Mark's, and shortly from St Patrick's in London and New York, and we hear whispers about Big Drum and Shakespeare Mass from Carrickoo in Huddersfield in Yorkshire. This is the masquerade of ancestors' past and ancestors' future in an unbroken procession. However, although I say unbroken, I do not mean unaltered. It must be acknowledged that there is no clear, straight line from the 17th century African masquerade and to the traditional mass seen at Spice Mass or Notting Hill in the 21st century. The durability of intangible cultural heritage is its flexibility and the ability to adapt to new circumstances. Like the changes to a stone in a river, traditional mass and carnival have been changed by displacement, creolization, migration, and just to name just a few of the external factors which have influenced the development of masquerade. The original religious and ritualistic meanings and aspects of masquerade costumes have been lost, and these have instead become signs, which now represent a group identity, such as the colour of the tabard of a short knee player represents their village and their belonging. But the African roots of carnival are still visible to see if looked for, even if sometimes obscured by the passage of time. And so when I looked at these roots, what did I find? Well, I'll give you a few examples of my theories, which are still theories, because so much more research is needed. At the beginning of his story, La Diabolesse, C.L.L. James writes, "In Grenada, more than any other West Indian island, you will find Black people who have preserved the secrets of their ancestors, secrets brought with them from the heart of Africa." Although C.L.L. James was writing in 1928, from my early research in the UK, it was clear that the strength of intangible cultural heritage and identity was still present in Grenada. And this is why I chose Grenada and Carriacou as the focus of my field research. When I visited Grenada in 2018, I met with traditional mass players as I crisscrossed the island on the catapult-like minibuses. And I experienced the sea crossing to Carriacou on the Osprey. I saw rich, dark forests and towering trees, deep valleys and rivers, wonderful shores, bright blue seas, and brightly painted houses. I saw fireflies, a turtle, flying fish, an iguana, and a hummingbird. Carriacou and Grenada are truly beautiful. I understood the value that is placed on your traditional mass when I saw a short-knee figure was the logo for your national lottery, and I can remember thinking that nothing like that would ever happen in the UK. Before arriving in Grenada, I had only really heard of jab jab and short knee, so I was amazed to find out how rich the traditional masquerade culture is. Here's a brief summary of what I found so far. I spent a lot of time looking at jab jab, horned and devil masks around the Caribbean. I wanted to look at something quite alien to the European masquerade so that the imitation and creolization arguments I talked about earlier could be more easily dismissed. Many of you who played jab jab have told me that the character appeared only after Emancipation, but I wondered if the jab jab had existed before, and if so, what were the possible origins of jab jab? There are many examples of horned masqueraders in contemporary 17th and 18th century records of enslaved Africans masquerading. Descriptions of cow and bull costumes complete with horns are provided by Hans Sloane and Edward Long, among others. There is also a tradition of black, red, and blue body coverings among the Epki of southeastern Nigeria, an area where many Igbo enslaved Africans were taken from. There is the worship of the Yoruba Orisha Oya, wife of Shango and summoner of ancestors, who is said to transform into a water buffalo. And then there is the horned Yoruba trickster Isu, also known as a devil. All of this suggests to me that before the jab jab became the Christian devil devil as it is now described, its roots could lie in one, many, or even all of the spiritual African masquerading traditions described there. And I explored these ideas further in my journal article in the Caribbean Quarterly in 2019. Verku, shortly, both use visors or masks as I was told today, which were also used in Yoruba Gungan Masquerade and other forms of African spiritual worship. The visor in a Gungan acts as a veil between this world and the ancestors in the next. Verku is a fascinating and unusual form of masquerade, which until recently included the ritualized beatings that can also be seen in stick fighting traditions in Trinidad. With wooden shoes sparking on the road and bells, it's a long way from the pretty mass which dominates carnival in the UK. I also looked at the bright cloths used in the fabric in the short-knee players' costumes and the traditional cloths used in Yoruba Gungan Masquerade. Gungan Masquerade is an important form of ancestor worship where masquerading characters bridge the world between the living and the dead. Gungan is performed at specific times by masquerading families who hold this responsibility for the community. The cloths and the colours of the cloths are incredibly important when attempting to summon the ancestors to come into the masquerade. Drumming and dancing traditions are also very important aspects of preserved intangible cultural heritage on Grenada. The Tivoli drummers play the drumming music of Grenada, including the drumming brought by the enslaved Africans. The music and rhythms, like big drum on Karaku, has preserved the cultural identity of these ancestors and is heard to this day. The Grenadian Folk Dance School teaches and performs the traditional folk dances of Grenada to traditional and recorded music. Another example of traditional mass with African roots can be seen in Shakespeare Mass on Karaku. Although the subject matter of the speeches, Julius Caesar, is a definite product of the colonization of Karaku by the British, the oratory and verbal dueling which can be seen are present in West Africa. In particular, the Akan people of Ghana, known as Kremanti on Karaku, traditionally use oratory to assert social superiority and relieve social tensions. Another oratory tradition can be seen in the Dagara people of northern Ghana, who select talented individuals to recite the Bagara Shur, a poetry ritual which can last for up to 3 days. I've been told that on Karaku, only the most skilled mass players are selected for the Carnival Day performances. In addition, the manner in which the Shakespeare mass speeches are delivered are firmly rooted in Caribbean culture. The mass players move and sway rather than delivering the speeches in a static European fashion. However, it is in big drum and nation dance that the retention of African cultures and their origins are plain to see. The big drum players have preserved the cultural identities of specific African nations from which the enslaved Africans came from and honour these ancestors in the order of their arrival on Karaku in their rituals. These are Kremanti, Aradi, Igbo, Congo, Mandingo, Chamba, Banda, and Temne. Big drum and nation dance are extremely important forms of intangible cultural heritage, and the analysis of big drum songs provides ample evidence of the plantation existence of the enslaved on Karaku. And if you have a look at the slide here, you can see this is a big drum song, which was to give information for people from Congo about what foods was safe to eat and which foods were. So you can see the Tululu crab, the newly arrivals were being encouraged to eat the Tululu crab because it was safe. So it's a song by the Congo people for the Congo people on Karaku, and having that level of specificity about the actual origins of intangible cultural heritage is very rare and very, very special. With the continued performance of over 300 years of drumming and dance rituals brought to Karaku from across West Africa, Big Drum provides us with the evidence with which to challenge the popular assumptions of deculturalization. Criticisms about the lack of historical knowledge about Caribbean and African history can be firmly rebutted. The intangible cultural heritage of Big Drum and nation dance allows us to refute this absolutely and move forward in our efforts to decolonize our history with confidence. However, I feel that I should add a note of caution into this celebration of culture. It is not enough to admire or even love intangible cultural heritage. It must be actively preserved. During my visit in 2018, I heard about the loss of traditional musicians on Karaku and how this has threatened the survival of the intangible cultural heritage of the quadrille. The most important form of intangible cultural heritage which is currently under threat, however, is the language of Patois. Without Patois, it is impossible to interpret and understand the knowledge that is being passed on, as we saw in the Big Drum song. If we can't understand Patois, we can't understand what was being sung or what is being sung. And so therefore, the work of Dr. Marguerite Joseph and her efforts to revitalise Patois on Grenada is absolutely vital in this area. And I explore this subject of Patois further in my forthcoming article in the International Journal of Carnival Arts, Volume 5, which is coming soon. So what are my next steps? Well, I will continue to research and celebrate the traditional mass of Grenada and our shared history. There are many forms of masks which I haven't even begun to look at, such as donkey masks, maypole dancing, mokos, mokojombis, and more. I hope to expand these findings to other Caribbean islands as well. I have completed my PhD and my thesis, Decoding 21st Century Carnival, will be published soon. I also plan to look at the impact of climate change and displacement on traditional masks in the Caribbean. For example, the loss of community and its masquerade due to weather displacement is a definite case study for exploration on this topic. I'm interested in using technology to help further with research. There are exciting possibilities ahead. We have so much more to discover. And I say we, because as an African, I believe we have a shared diasporic future and a shared history to reclaim. I have visited Grenada just once and for a very short time, but I have thought about Grenada and Carriacou, your people, your landscape, and of course your mass, almost constantly.